We're going to Massachusetts. Lyndsay Dowd.
Hey Mickey, this has been extraordinary, and I'm doing everything I can not to cry because you're just tugging on all of the heartstrings from October 6th. So this is a two-parter. One, what has your involvement been since October 6th? And the second part to that is how can we stay optimistic about the situation there and the hostages having a chance to come home?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I'll try and answer it three-parter, so forgive me if I forget about it, but forget different
Okay.
parts. I'll try. I'm saying that to myself, so I know three things. First one, since October 7th, again, that's post my book. There's nothing about October 7th in my book except for the Gilad Shalit negotiations that informed a lot of how I do this. Um, Very quickly, I was approached by a whole lot of families of missing people. We didn't know hostages, not hostages, missing people. 67 came really quickly into this. And I only work on behalf of families at their request, of course, at no cost to them. We're a non-for-profit organization, but that's the mandate that I have. And we had to come up very quickly with a theory of return, which is, again, the script or the pathway, the shortest way that a hostage comes home. And in this case, we based on three assumptions. The first one, Israel and Hamas do not talk. So it has to be mediated. And even the mediation that I did for Gilad Shalit years before is not in the cards for this one. It's going to have to be mediated differently. Number two, there are four countries or governments in the region that can influence Hamas. None of them can control Hamas. That's a misconception. Hamas is a very proud, independent Palestinian program, but four governments can influence them, and that is Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Qatar. And as you can imagine, none of them have any interest in helping Israel. But at least two of them have an interest in collaborating and helping the US. So the theory of return, therefore, was one, we had to make this an American priority very quickly, very visibly, and at the presidential level. Once it was made that way, the mediators in my case Qatar and Egypt, because they want to work with the Americans, would be able to go to Hamas and say, look, we know you have this conflict with Israel, but this is about the Americans, our allies. We need to come up with a proposal for how to solve the hostage part of it. And once they solicit those deals, if they're even half decent, and they're never good, they're never pretty, they're never good, but even if they're half decent, then the American administration will work with the Israeli prime minister to make him as comfortable as needed in order to sign and implement. That was the theory of return. And it worked like magic. 54 days, more than 100 hostages back are numbers that are never heard of from this. And yes, it's 54 days too late. And yes, it was only 100. It's about half of the people that were taken, but still, it was a tremendous success and it worked. I have been doing this work, coming up with the theory of return, working with the administration, by the way, didn't need to push much on the president on this one. That was what we saw on October 7th was President Biden's DNA. That was it wasn't politics, it was him. And he met with families very quickly, and that was what was needed. The Qataris took that meeting, went to Hamas, and actually told them, before you even give us a proposal, we need a proof of concept. And two American women from the Chicago area were released at no cost, just to prove the concept that channel can exist. And then when the Israeli government approved it, I was in Israel to work with the families to get the Israeli government to approve it. Then I flew to Doha, and over there, I never sit actually at the formal table. I'm outside. And both sides, or three sides in this case, Hamas, Israelis, and Qatar, call my cell phone at the lobby of the hotel to test with me how far they can push the envelope without blowing it up. Because if you bring it up at the official table and it's too much, deal is done. And things like, Hamas never showed up every day. If you guys, those who you remember, every day they were supposed to show up with a list of 10 that will be released that day. And there were supposed to be certain categories. Hamas never showed up with what Israel expected, and Israel never showed up with what Hamas expected. But there would be different categories, different priorities, different kind of things on the Israeli side, different Palestinian categories of prisoners released. And there was a clear understanding that the moment, and that I convey that the moment that Hamas shows up with less than 10, Israel is going to walk away. And the last day they showed up with 7, and Israel walked away. And I did everything I could to try and convince the Israelis to take the 7 and then walk away. I couldn't. There was a principle there that couldn't do it. Unfortunately, none of the 7 have survived since. But that was kind of the involvement, my involvement in the first part. As I mentioned, then I went back home to be with my family because there were 2 weeks of fighting. There was nothing to be done. Went back to Doha at the request of the Israelis, because the prime minister wouldn't send the head of the Mossad back to the negotiations, and they wanted to find out what is available so they can convince the prime minister to go back to it. So I did that, and that ended up in the December 20th deal that I told you about. And I tried to work really, really hard. The American administration has tried to work really hard to make the prime minister comfortable enough to do it. He was not. And I realized in early January that the fundamental calculation of the prime minister is opposite the deal. And so we started thinking, okay, what are the other things that we can do to leverage this? And over the next few months, we developed a different proposition that included focusing on the Americans that are being held, because that's the president's primary responsibility here. It's his constituents, in a deal that will look like it's bypassing the Israelis. And the idea behind it was not in order to leave behind the rest of the hostages, but knowing that if there is a pending deal that brings back the Americans, it puts the prime minister of Israel in a position where he cannot hold back. It's embarrassing to have President Biden bring back hostages while the Israeli prime minister cannot. The White House has been extremely cautious with this in an election year, knowing that it will be seen or portrayed as a betrayal of Israel. I think there were ways to mitigate that, and I think it was the responsibility of the president, but especially over the last several months, the White House allowed us to pursue this, and we are, and I can't talk in many details of it, but that goes to the last question, the last part of your question on this. Look, all hope is not lost on this. Unfortunately for the hostages who died, it is, but we still need to get the remains back to their families as well. So there's still a deal to be made. There are still live and living hostages. There's still a way to get them. There's the larger deal that is still on the table, and there is a potential smaller deal that bypasses the humanitarian deal, that might or might not lead to a bigger one. But for me, there's a Jewish saying: if you save one life, you save the whole world. If we can get any hostage that we can get out of this alive is a pure gain. So we're working on everything we can in order to do it, and these are actually direct negotiations with Hamas that we're doing, not through mediators. The last thing I would say, because we've been focusing on Gaza. Sorry, Scott, I answer a lot.
No,